The air inside the abandoned retail complex was not just still, it was heavy, thick with the scent of dried plaster, cheap sealant, and the ghostly trace of 1,000 forgotten perfumes. This was the landscape of the late 2020s, the architectural tombstone marking the precise moment when the seemingly immortal giants of American commerce finally surrendered. We are not talking about the gradual decline that characterized the 2010s. This was the sudden, seismic crash of 2025, the moment when the last pillars upholding the sprawling physical retail economy buckled simultaneously. The failure was not merely economic, it was a profound cultural unraveling, the death of an entire way of shopping and living. Look closely at the cavernous space where, barely 5 years prior, the relentless, pulsating neon of Forever 21 dominated the upper level, offering an endless, dizzying carousel of ephemeral fashion. Now, the glass facade was grimy, marred by foreclosure notices layered thick as sedimentary rock. The security grates were pulled tight, creating a visual barrier that felt less like a closure and more like an incarceration. For decades, Forever 21 was the physical embodiment of impulse, of instant gratification, the retail cathedral built for the teenage masses who demanded novelty faster than the supply chain could deliver it. Its collapse, finalized dramatically in the mid-2020s, was the visible, glitter-strewn debris field of an unsustainable model. The spectacular failure of chasing volume over value, of confusing endless debt with infinite growth. But the real mystery, the chilling systemic infection that defined the retail apocalypse of 2025, wasn't just the sputtering out of fast fashion. It was the simultaneous implosion of essential, seemingly indispensable services. Travel down the scarred parking lot, past the broken light poles, and you reach the dark shell of what was once a Rite Aid pharmacy. This was not a store selling disposable trinkets. This was where communities sourced their medicine, where the elderly picked up vital prescriptions, where local health needs were meant to be met. When Rite Aid, a recognized cornerstone of neighborhood stability with thousands of locations across the country, finally succumbed to its overwhelming financial malignancies and was forced into widespread liquidation. The message was clear and terrifying. The foundational support structure of the physical economy was dissolving. The cracks were not superficial. They ran through the very concrete of Main Street. How could two institutions, operating in utterly different sectors, one focused on disposable aesthetics, the other on health and necessity, reach the point of total systemic failure at the exact same historical inflection point? This is the central conflict of the 2025 collapse. The superficial answer, trotted out by financial analysts for years, was the omnipotent shadow of e-commerce, specifically the inexorable growth of Amazon. But to blame Amazon is to confuse the symptom with the cause. Amazon was the wind that blew the house down. The house crumbled because its foundations were termite-eaten by internal corruption, financial leverage, and a staggering, almost willful technological inertia. The crisis of 2025 wasn't triggered by a sudden innovation. It was the delayed reckoning for decades of disastrous decision-making, rooted in the false premise of permanent, low-interest capital. These companies were victims of a toxic cocktail. They were simultaneously addicted to cheap debt for physical expansion, while being terrified of investing necessary capital into complex digital infrastructure. They were, in essence, trying to fight a war in the cloud, while chained firmly to the ground by millions of square feet of unprofitable real estate. This investigative journey must uncover the specific mechanism of failure. Why, with their vast scale and established customer bases, did giants like Forever 21 and Rite Aid fail to pivot, while smaller, more nimble competitors managed to survive or even thrive by integrating truly personalized digital experiences? What was the specific, final financial event? Perhaps a combination of shifting Federal Reserve policy and the expiration of pandemic-era rent forbearance agreements that finally shattered their highly leveraged balance sheets right around that critical mid-decade mark? These are the open loops, the threads we must pull to understand the true pathology of the retail apocalypse. Let us begin with the bright, devastating tragedy of Forever 21. Their problem was never sales, it was over-sales. The brand operated on a logistical model that demanded constant high-volume inventory turnover, flooding massive floor plates with thousands of new takenaos every week. This model was financially predicated on two crucial, now-defunct pillars: perpetually low import costs from Asia and the ability to negotiate insanely favorable, long-term leases within Class A malls, making them the indispensable anchor tenant. The initial warning signs were blaring in 2019 when the company filed its first massive bankruptcy. But that filing was not a cure. It was merely a temporary postponement of the inevitable. The new ownership structure, frequently involving layers of private equity and mall landlords who had a vested interest in keeping the lights on, even if the business itself was toxic, fundamentally failed to address the core logistical illness. They continued to operate stores that were simply too large for a digitally fragmented shopping populace. By 2023, the equation had shifted violently. Global supply chains, still reeling from geopolitical instability and the inflationary pressures of the early 2020s, had made the cost of constantly churning cheap polyester untenable. Simultaneously, the core customer base, Gen Z, had begun to turn against the brand, not just economically, but morally. The growing awareness around fast fashion's immense environmental footprint and labor practices made the act of buying a $5 shirt feel less like a bargain and more like a moral compromise. Forever 21 tried desperately to pivot to sustainability and reduced footprints, but they were too slow, too debt-burdened, and too visually associated with the old, wasteful ways to gain credibility. The massive, dusty shell of the physical store became a liability, a symbol of environmental irresponsibility that digital native brands, operating without physical baggage, could easily shame them over. The failure here was a complex intersection of financial mismanagement and a fatal cultural misreading of the evolving consumer ethos. Now, consider the parallel decay of Rite Aid. The pharmacy chain's demise was quieter, perhaps more insidious, because its services felt essential. Rite Aid's trajectory toward 2025 was a textbook case of death by excessive financial leverage, compounded by operational stagnation. Unlike Forever 21, which died quickly and brightly, Rite Aid suffered a slow, agonizing hemorrhage. The root of Rite Aid's critical debt lay in aggressive, desperate mergers, specifically the acquisition of the Brooks-Eckerd chain back in 2007. This strategic move saddled the company with billions in debt that it could never effectively shed, perpetually forcing them to play catch-up against the much larger, more profitable, and geographically dominant rivals, CVS and Walgreens. While their competitors were successfully integrating health clinics and robust digital prescription platforms, Rite Aid was spending its limited cash flow simply servicing ancient debt and fighting an unwinnable price war. The real tipping point for Rite Aid, however, was twofold and crystallized around 2025. First, the widespread and successful deployment of prescription mail-order services, including Amazon's specialized fulfillment operations, fundamentally eroded the profitability of the local pharmacy visit. Why drive to a struggling retail location when maintenance medication could be delivered reliably to your door? Second, and more catastrophically, Rite Aid was crushed under the immense weight of legal liabilities related to the opioid crisis. By the mid-2020s, settlement and legal defense costs associated with these claims proved to be the unpayable debt, the financial anchor that no operational restructuring could lift. Rite Aid and Forever. 21, separated by product but united by fatal flaws, were both victims of poor capital allocation and an unshakable belief in the physical footprint. The leadership teams in both cases suffered from profound technological tunnel vision. They viewed e-commerce as a side project, an annoying competitor, rather than the core operating model. They never understood that the future of retail wasn't about simply selling online. It was about using sophisticated data and algorithms to eliminate waste, personalize offers, and optimize inventory down to the hyper-local level, a capability that their ancient, disparate IT systems simply could not support. This is the pattern interrupt. The retail apocalypse of 2025 was not simply a war between physical and digital. It was a failure of data versus inertia. The winners were the companies who could predict demand with surgical precision, reducing inventory hold times and cutting down on markdowns. The losers, including our retail icons, were trapped in a cycle of over-ordering, high debt, and massive promotional clearance sales, which perpetually eroded their margins. These companies were not victims of external progress. They were architects of their own obsolescence, standing on mountains of crippling long-term debt, foolishly waiting for the physical crowds to return to their excessively large, poorly managed stores. The final decisive event that ensured the collapse of both these highly leveraged entities around 2025 wasn't a technological breakthrough by Amazon, but a policy shift emanating from the Federal Reserve. Throughout the early 2020s, retail debt was sustained by an environment of historically low interest rates. Companies like Rite Aid could perpetually refinance their liabilities, kicking the can down the road in hopes of a miracle turnaround. But as the Fed aggressively raised rates to combat lingering inflation, the cost of servicing existing debt skyrocketed, and refinancing became ruinously expensive or simply impossible. For Forever 21, this meant that the capital needed to finally rationalize their real estate portfolio and execute necessary digital upgrades was suddenly inaccessible. For Rite Aid, the high interest rates, combined with the crushing opioid liabilities, meant the entire financial structure imploded, leading to the rapid closure of entire regional divisions. The cheap money lifeline that had sustained the illusion of solvency for 2 decades was suddenly cut, and the financial gravity of their overextension finally took hold. The grand revelation of the retail apocalypse 2025 is that the death blow was delivered not by a digital competitor, but by the cessation of cheap capital. E-commerce merely provided the exit route for consumers. The central banks provided the final execution order for the businesses. They died because they prioritized maximizing massive, unproductive square footage over optimizing the customer journey and maintaining a healthy balance sheet. The lesson left, written on the dusty windows of these abandoned giants, is a sobering one. In the 21st century, scale without efficiency is a liability, and debt without genuine innovation is a death sentence. The era of retail based on physical presence and gut feeling is over. What remains is a world optimized by algorithms, where only the leanest, most digitally integrated operations can survive. This sets the stage for the next phase of the investigation: the rise of the specialized predators and the strange new geography of commerce that filled the sudden, massive void left by the fallen icons of yesteryear. The store is closed, but the story has just begun.